You know, since Western civilization has developed from a Judeo-Christian worldview, it is very common for civic, legal, or other recognized authorities to speak of religious subjects, but missing a biblical context. And so there are those, both inside and outside the umbrella of historic Christianity, who are promoting falsehoods and living by them. Remember, heresy is a teaching that's contrary to God's word, often based in God's word, but it gets watered down and often begins on side issues until it gets out of balance. And we started a new study a couple of weeks ago, and in that time we have compiled a profile of the traits that describe false teachers, what they promote, and how they live. The first 19 that we collected concerning false teachers or their doctrines come from 2 Peter chapter 2. Another 10 come from 1 Timothy 6. This requires us to keep centered on the one core question that will be with us throughout this particular study. Is it true? I've printed sheets with a more complete list that we've been creating over the past couple of weeks, and they're downstairs in the foyer on your way out if you want to take one home. But that collection of nearly 30 descriptions really does cover the bases very well. And what they represent is a comprehensive warning for us to be discerning and to be watchful. Consider the heresy profile that you've developed over the past 2 weeks, a list of potential ingredients in a deadly recipe. You may have just one or many of them merging together to form some type of person or some idea that's being promoted. And so these specific examples are part of a larger picture. And they are ultimately part of a philosophy or an ideology, a way of looking at the world. Let me take you to a portion of the letter to the Colossians to explain this a little further. And then I want to introduce one specific example that is affecting us today. The Colossian Church was a fairly strong group of believers, and yet as a city, Colossae had been overshadowed by neighboring towns. By the time of the New Testament, it was not the first choice on the itinerary of places to see if you're going through Asia Minor or ancient Greece. Not quite canceled by the surrounding culture, but not very popular either. They were considered just a backwoods type of town, a very discouraging place to hold on to hope as you try to be an example and witness for Christ. And as Paul wrote to them, they were already facing a developing deception that had undermined the centrality of the person of Christ. If this Colossian heresy were allowed to take root and was believed, it would undermine their faith. It would rob them of their joy, their effectiveness in ministry, and their confidence in what they first learned about God's grace and forgiveness in the cross. So Paul's emphasis, if you look at the first chapter, begins with the details of who Christ is, what he has done, and what it means for Jesus to be Lord above all. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. With this introduction in mind, I want you to pay attention to this next word, because it will become an important issue when confronting any number of deceptions that we encounter in our current lives. It is the word Gnosticism. It comes from the Greek word for knowledge or to know. And as the New Testament period moved into the 2nd century, Gnosticism became much more detailed and systematic as a form of heresy. But at this time, it was very simplistic. It was a collection of false teachings. And an early form of Gnostic beliefs was threatening the Colossians' faith. Here's why it's so dangerous to what we believe. All Gnosticism is rooted in this particular mindset, which believes that what we've been given concerning God, the Scriptures, observable truth in creation and the person of Christ, it's just not enough. Gnosticism claims that in order to understand the universe, the world, God's nature, man's nature, spiritual realities, or even to become more intimate with God, you needed special, even hidden information. And only a few privileged people possessed it. Therefore, you must follow the expert, the teacher, or the group that has that particular knowledge that you desire. Otherwise, you will never get higher in your connection with what's true, and you will never gain greater access to spiritual realities. It does not matter if the hidden knowledge is specifically religious or simply some intriguing new perspective on how to view life and the universe. Deceptions ultimately entice us to have second thoughts about what we've already learned concerning what is true. They are ideas that beg us to be dissatisfied with Jesus and look somewhere else for purpose, for wholeness, emotional excitement, real relationships, power, or wisdom. So as we look at Colossians chapter 2, Paul explains his purpose in writing. He writes because he does not want the believers to be ignorant. His prayer is actually for them to know all they can know. However, it is a knowledge that is powerful and real and life-changing because it's only found in the person of Christ. Colossians 2:2. My purpose is that believers may be encouraged in heart and united in love so that they may have the full riches of complete understanding, a word for knowledge, in order that they may know the mystery of God, namely Christ, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. 4 terms to deal with truth. I tell you this so that no one may deceive you by fine-sounding arguments. From here, God gives us a warning and a command, and this is the focal point for today. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of this world, rather than on Christ. Now, most of us have not lived through a war where those captured are taken as property, and we must abandon our families, our homeland, our traditions, even our faith. But that's the image here. It's the picture of kidnapping, human trafficking, and slavery. And such images are supposed to unsettle us enough that we will not want to be enticed or captured by beliefs and prophecies that are counterfeits to the gospel. And the captivity begins in a certain context, not a physical location, but the context of thought and value. See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy. This is a word that has a wide range of meaning, both in the first century and now. It's actually a compound term made up of 2 Greek words, friendship, love, and wisdom. So philosophy is literally a love of wisdom. Proverbs confirms that a love of wisdom is a God-ordained passion and one that we're commanded to pursue. So this verse is not a condemnation of rational thought, organizational thinking, or philosophy as a course of discipline that you can study. It is a denunciation of those philosophies that do not line up with God's revelation. And we're given a couple of criteria here which we can tell if the worldview that we're examining is legitimate or not. The counterfeit is hollow and deceptive. You may not always be able to identify the emptiness and deceitfulness right away, but it's part of developing discernment throughout your lifetime. We need to be able to take the information that we encounter and receive and consider how it matches with reason, how it lines up with history, how it can play out over time with potential long-term consequences, and ultimately how it compares with Scripture. Beyond the indicators of emptiness and deceit, there are a couple of other warning signs to look out for. The first is this: it is a philosophy which depends on human tradition. Tradition is a reference to the old ways from long ago, passed down from generation to generation. You see, in many cases, the ancient ways were considered the most reliable because they stood the test of time. And that is true in a lot of cases. Yet just because it is ancient does not mean it is God-honoring. And I find it curious that we are witnessing now increasingly, both inside and outside of official Christianity, the return to the more ceremonial and mystical practices to find spiritual meaning. And those practices are drawing more followers. The philosophies that are based in human tradition would include an appeal to find and use information that has been lost but is now found, like additional books for the Bible, manuscripts from former civilizations, and they would include an appeal to ways that have been forbidden by cultures that found them dangerous. The second warning is to evaluate some ideology by this concept, to see if they are philosophies that are based according to elemental spirits of the world, not according to Christ. Often, the current and dominant worldviews that people operate from are naturalistic. They form the perspectives of what they can observe in the natural world, and it stops there. However, if elemental spirits in this text sounds like we're dealing with more than just nature, you'd be correct. For many cultures, even in the 21st century, it is understood that spiritual beings were behind the natural elements, behind the planets that hung in the sky, behind the constellations that could be drawn out in a night landscape. So the natural elements took on spiritual significance. In what we now consider the realm of astronomy or physics, they would combine with godlike qualities. Those who follow the zodiac believe that your life, personality, and destiny were determined by the month you were born. So those powers in this line of thinking need to be respected, appeased, or worshipped if your life is going to be any good or you're going to get a blessing. Not much has changed since Paul wrote to Colossians in the first century. And we have perspectives in our society that end up on both ends of this naturalistic approach to things. On one, it's the very natural materialistic, that all we see, all we can know is what we can know with our senses. On the other end, there's this spiritual concept that there's a belief that there's a spirit or deeper meaning beyond the physical, and it's all hidden, so you are required to go find it out on your own. One of these hollow and deceptive philosophies is fully entrenched in every aspect of our society right now, and yet it's being preached and integrated as fact inside of education, law enforcement, courtrooms, medical industry, churches and denominations, the banking industry, farming industry, large corporations, private businesses, entertainment, news organizations, local civics, social media, and individual families. It's actually called a theory, critical theory. This is the parent worldview, the overall ideology that fuels the thought process for all of its children. And yet the title itself is a curious one, because what it promotes is fairly deep. I'm only going to be able to give us an overview, an introduction at this point. I read several books on this subject over this past year, and one was a very thorough but very good explanation where this first word, critical, was replaced with something to be more accurate. The more you learn about this philosophy, the more you can see why cynical is a better option. Ironically, critical theory is exactly what it says it is in many respects. It is not critical in the sense of making an honest evaluation to determine what works, what needs correction, and what needs to be substituted out for something better. It is not a pursuit of reason, evidence, or truth, even though such terms are often employed by critical theorists. But it is quite critical of virtually everything that once held value, while it is reckless in its evaluation process. It is critical in that its starting point is looking to find problems, even where the problems are either minimal or no longer particularly relevant. And where it does identify legitimate concerns, its solutions are destructive and add more problems, not improvements. It begins with the premise that most, if not all things in this world are damaged. Now, we would agree with that. But it goes beyond that observation. It goes beyond evidence collection or taking the time to compare notes with other researchers to find out what's real and what's just more imagined. It is critical because it has decided ahead of time what the problem is, why it's there, and what has to happen to make it right. And if you disagree with those conclusions, then it becomes critical of you. It is also a theory. It's being publicized as simply a tool or a method to analyze the world. Now, if that were true, it might be worth checking out and evaluating how that tool might allow us to see the world in a different perspective. And selling it as a tool or method sounds harmless enough, but in reality, those are not accurate descriptions. As a result, the prominent religious leaders in entire congregations are also promoting critical theory now as a worldview that's worthwhile as an option to examine ethics in life as we know it. But it's actually more like a hammer that sees everything as a nail, whether it's a nail or not. It claims to be a theory, but ultimately it's making observations and drawing conclusions about human behavior, motives of the heart, and determination of right and wrong. But as I said, it's not based on verifiable research, and it's not ultimately interested in objective truth. The reason these things are not really priorities is this. Critical theory is not a research mechanism. It is an ideology, a belief system. Critical theory, including all of its children, is a perspective about our world that determines what is true or what is wrong. And yet, any data that does not line up with theory gets rejected. As believers, we already have a tool that has not changed and has been consistently reliable. It was given to us to understand and make conclusions about human behavior, motives of the heart, and the determination of right and wrong, truth and lies. Besides His Word, God gave us minds to evaluate truth claims. He commands us to accurately assess our experiences and learning so that we can exercise wisdom, particularly in those areas of life that do not have a specific verse that tells us exactly what to do. I offered this example a few weeks back when we looked at using reason and evidence to determine the legitimacy of something. The scientific method was born out of a belief that there was order in the universe because a God of order created it. The scientific method begins with a hypothesis. It's formed by observation of some aspect of creation. Experiments are then done, measurements are taken, records are kept, and more tests are done to find out if this hypothesis may be correct or not. Once some basic conclusions are available, the process and data are presented for others to examine and review, and the testing cycle begins again, until it becomes more and more clear whether or not this hypothesis is provable. From this time-intensive process, certain knowledge about our world is then uncovered and presented as something true, like the discovery of gravity. You can have a different belief system that denies the existence of gravity. But when you try to fly off the Chrysler building, because you're sure that your theory is just as valid, you'll find out that your beliefs didn't change what is true. Critical theory not only rejects this process of elimination and testing as a valid process, the scientific method is considered wicked, vile, and hateful. And yet, since critical theory is best at finding fault, it cannot offer a better option than what it condemns. And as I said, it begins by finding something wrong and then draws conclusion based on that belief, but not based on objective reality. Critical theory is chiefly concerned with revealing hidden biases and under-examined assumptions that we all carry, usually by pointing out what have been termed problematics, which are ways in which society and the systems that it operates upon are going wrong. If this sounds a bit cryptic, I apologize. Much of this will be more understandable as we dig in further over the next several weeks. But let's start with this insight. When the world is viewed through the critical theory lens, there are problems in all human interactions in every human social structure. Hidden biases, under-examined assumptions. Critical theory says that our vocabulary, our family systems, and our work interactions are all tainted with hidden problematics. And yet, let me add this other explanation as well. Critical theorists maintain that a primary goal of this philosophy is to understand and help overcome the social structures through which people are dominated and oppressed. You see, when viewed through the critical theory lens, everything is a power struggle. Their foundation for understanding all relationships in all organizations that exist is that it is a battle for dominance. There are only overlords and victims, where the overlords must be brought down and the victims emancipated. And those who embrace this ideology are convinced that we say things and do things to feed the systems of domination even when we're not even aware of it. To help us understand how we arrived at this dismal place in history, we need to look at a couple of other terms that you've probably heard. So stay with me as we have to get into the weeds for a little while in order to trace the threads of this heresy to where we are. These historical perspectives of the world and humanity are branches of the same family tree that's now bearing fruit before our eyes. We start with the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment, certain ideas were promoted and then carried down to the present day. While a belief in God was still common and acceptable during this time, he just wasn't needed the same way as much anymore. Over those centuries, the scientific method had uncovered all kinds of amazing things about our world and the creation, to the point that we thought we could figure out things on our own now. Thank you very much. At the core, the Enlightenment questioned the traditional authority structures that existed and believed that humanity could be improved through rational change. Reason became the new authority rather than divine revelation. Now, Christians believe that God gave us rational thought. But the Enlightenment is a serious turn away on the road towards God. Remember, false teaching simply has to take a degree or two to one side or the other before it gets off. And this belief survived into the period of the Industrial Revolution and into the era of modernism. Under modernism, God's word became more of a mythical explanation for the world, not a place you could count on to know what's true. However, modernism still believed that there is an objective natural reality, a reality whose existence and properties are logical and they're independent of human beings. Modernism would say that because observable truth is not affected by your thoughts or your biases or social structures, then any statement or claims in science and history could be shown as true or false. Again, you can reject the idea that gravity is real, but your social standing, your ethnic background, or your level of material wealth cannot alter the fact that something's holding you down from flying off into space. Here are a few of the other points of modernism. Human nature consists of capacities and dispositions that are present at birth. We would call that nature or DNA. Another one is that language refers to and represents a reality outside of itself. We know that God is the one who gave us language to understand realities beyond ourselves. And words do mean things. So defining our terms and using them in the same way is critical to interpersonal relationships and maintaining healthy relationships. A couple of other points of this ideology will become more relevant as we go further into this study later. But one was this idea that human reason, in cooperation with research and compiling evidence, should enable people to construct a general theory of human history, what's called a meta-narrative. A meta-narrative offers an explanation of our purpose and destiny. The problem with modernism on this point is that modernism already dismissed completely the aspect of God's hand in determining that story. So while they can make some legitimate points along the way of what they observe, whatever overarching narrative that they can offer will be missing the foundation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The other relevant point is a restatement of one of the ideas from the Enlightenment. Through reason, logic, science, and technology, human beings are likely to change themselves and their societies for the better. If you found yourself seeing problems with some of the points concerning modernism that I just listed, and yet agreeing at least somewhat with others, good. Hollow and deceptive philosophies are only going to reach the greatest number of victims if there's enough truth wrapped in with the lies. As those created in the image of God with the internal capacity to know right from wrong, people can sense when something just doesn't add up when they hear it. They may just not understand why or how they feel something is off. For those who belong to Christ, part of our job is to discern such things and get better and better at discovering and explaining the how and the why. So don't be afraid to confirm what is worthwhile and true within the various philosophies and theories that you will encounter in this world. This brings us to the era after modernism. Postmodernism grew up in the 1960s, taking much of what had been accepted ideas and ways of functioning in society, good or bad, and turning them on their ears. Postmodernism, also spelled with a hyphen, is a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, relativism. It's a general suspicion of reason and an accurate sensitivity to the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. In other words, what you believe by way of your ideology should express itself, must express itself, by changing politics, economies, and society overall. Now, I hope to come back to this explanation another time, but let's unpack it for a moment. Postmodernism took the same points of modernism and altered course even further away from God. Here's a point-by-point comparison from the Encyclopedia Britannica, which actually did a very good job with it. Modernism, they say, there's an objective natural reality. Postmodernism says, no, reality is a construct. It's a concept made up just because we use language. Yeah, I didn't quite get it the first time through either. So a construct is an idea that has been created and accepted by the people in society. So let me give you a very harmless and generic example. Adulthood. When does it begin? The answer is 18. You're legally responsible for yourself. You can join the military, sign contracts, and be tried as an adult in court. But shouldn't the answer be 17? When you can control a 2,000-pound death machine at fatal speeds? Or maybe 16, as it is in other states outside of New Jersey that allow you to have a driver's license also. But wait a minute. Isn't adulthood actually 21? Since you can die for your country in the military as long as you don't have a drink because you're still a minor. Or is it 25, when you're allowed to rent a car without additional fees because everybody knows before your 25th birthday you're too young to be responsible with a car? Confusing, I know, because adulthood is a social construct. Each society defines it a bit differently. Adulthood is an idea that's created and accepted by a culture, even without hard evidence behind it. So we accept such things. We're not denying that. Well, postmodern philosophy says all of that's true about reality. Reality is created in the minds of a society, whether there's legitimate evidence for that reality or not. Let's keep going. Modernism would say that science and history could be shown as true or false. Postmodernism says there is no such thing as truth, except the one from my experience. Now, just with these 2 points alone, you can see how easy it becomes to create your own reality and your own truth if you embrace this philosophy. Next, modernism said human nature consists of capacities and dispositions that are present at birth, what you're born with, your nature. Postmodernism says all aspects of human psychology are socially determined. Nurture, it's from your environment. Isn't it really both? Modernism says language refers to and represents a reality outside of itself. Postmodernism says, no, the same word is not fixed, but can have multiple meanings. This is why you start to think you're losing your mind. When the clear and accepted meaning of a term, a common term, is no longer being used the way you know it. It is not you. Modernism would say, through reason, logic, science, and technology, human beings are likely to change themselves and their societies for the better. Postmodernism says science and technology have killed millions of lives. Reason and logic, therefore, are inherently destructive because they've been used by evil people to oppress others. Since postmodernism is the step-parent for what we now call critical theory, a brief review of the major tenets of postmodernism offers us an understanding of critical theory. So these two are basically the same thing, just a newer term, that's all. So let me give you some summary points that I found helpful in trying to put all this into a package that starts to make sense. And if it's not, you are not alone. The first principle is how this worldview perceives knowledge and truth and how they are obtained. The postmodern knowledge principle carries a radical skepticism about whether objective knowledge or truth is obtainable at all. Yet there is a commitment to cultural constructivism. An example of cultural constructivism, social construct, is the illustration we just used about when adulthood begins. And each society, they say, determines when a person is considered adult. Therefore, each society determines what's true and what's real. So let me explain this a little bit further. We realize as humans that we're limited in our ability to know everything. And our ability to know is limited to the language that we use or the concepts that we work with and the categories that we function with to discuss and understand the world around us. Critical theorists agree with us on that. But as believers, our response to this limitation would be, wouldn't it? Well, while we accept that we cannot know all that is true, that's the domain of God, that's His capacity, there are truths that can be known. See the difference? Because God has revealed those things to us, both in His creation, according to Romans 1, and through His Word, for sure. God created the universe. God made us in His image, Genesis 1. The cross of Jesus is God's answer to man's sin. We know that the Bible, as a source of truth, has long ago been rejected by theory. But the knowledge principle of critical theory and postmodernism goes further. They say that because we are limited in our ability to know everything that is true, because we're limited in our understanding of context based on where we live and grew up and what we've individually experienced, then all truth claims are equally valid. Cultural constructivism, in this first piece of the principle, is the title given to the belief that's promoted and accepted, as I said, by a particular group of people. They argue that since truth or reality is determined by the culture who created or embraced certain beliefs, then you would be able to argue that taking the life of an innocent is not necessarily wrong. If your culture believes it's wrong, then for them, that is their truth. But that's not our society's truth or my truth. And this is the new logic when there is no baseline for objective reality. And like any false ideology, it cannot be consistent in what it says and does. It's impossible. Because in practice, the idea that you can determine your own truth is only valid to a certain point before it actually does conflict with somebody else's truth. Remember this from the last couple of weeks of studying heresy. Errors in teaching lead to errors in living. Well, critical theory is not just a theory, and so it leads to errors in living. Critical theory has a very deliberate application for what it promotes. The ability to make up your own truth serves as the fuel to take action, to put that truth into practice for somebody else. So let me explain. It's not an exaggeration to look back on the postmodern era. In many cases, we were either kids or not even born when that thing was taking place, as a time of revolution. The 60s made that very clear. Revolution is at the foundation of both postmodern and critical theory. And yet there's another term that's less startling, which is used in accomplishing that revolution: deconstruct. To take something apart with the intention of exposing biases, flaws, or inconsistencies. Now, this is not an inherently a bad exercise. I'm doing it right now in explaining how dangerous critical theory is. And it's not inherently bad when the goal is to learn from and improve what you find. But in critical theory, deconstruction is not the first step to improve. It's the avenue taken to dismantle those things that are considered broken and irredeemable, to remove those things that stand in the way of this new philosophy from being accepted, to replace those perceived obstacles with solutions created by those who are committed to the theory. Which brings us to the application of critical theory: political and social revolution. The critical theory or postmodern political principle is this: a belief that society is formed of systems of power and hierarchies, which we've already touched on, which decide what can be known and how knowledge can be obtained. And there are four major themes that coincide with these two principles. So let me list them as if I'm speaking from a critical theory worldview. First is the blurring of boundaries. So if I believe this, I would say, who are you to say that there's a difference between male and female? Power of language is the second. Those who control the language have the power. So When your definition of some word bothers me, I will create and use a new definition. Then you no longer control me. I control you. Cultural relativism, number 3. Who are you to say that one culture has a practice that is wrong? What you call sin is my expression of love. And number 4, the loss of the individual and the universal. What group you belong to is where you obtain your ultimate identity. There are no individuals, and there are no central or universal guidelines for all of humanity. The second principle, the political one, helps us to bridge the gap between theory and practice. Whatever a person's worldview is, it will ultimately show itself by how they live. So the application to critical theory is known by its activist arm, and this one I know you know, social justice. Remember, in critical theory, words are no longer defined as objective means, but redefined in order to achieve a goal. So this simple term has become a serious point of confusion and problem for us. And I use capital letters to distinguish this from the lowercase social justice. Because this proper noun is not talking about bringing true justice to our nation, our neighborhoods. Remember, God is no longer included in any of the understanding or definitions of what is actually just. So when the average person hears this phrase, or other phrases that come from the same worldview, it is very normal for you to want to say that you do agree. There should be a society that has justice, but that would be the lowercase social justice, the way you mean it. And that's the trap that so many, including believers, have already fallen into. Social justice, with a capital S and J, is deconstructing traditional systems and structures considered to be oppressive, including your nuclear family, and redistributing power and resources from oppressors to their victims in the pursuit of equality of outcome. If you have $10, your neighbor has $5, I have to take the rest from you and give it to the other person. Social justice is a title for an ideology, a belief system that sees the world from the critical theory perspective. And the points that define critical theory are put into practice through social justice, as capital nouns, to make critical theory the way that every part of society will function. If you're starting to see double at this point, you're not alone. So we should wrap this up for now. But there's a couple of things I'd like you to seriously consider between now and next Sunday. One is connected to one of the tenets that we touched on earlier. It's part of this deception that will have an immeasurable impact in the last days, and more specifically in our capacity to share the message of Christ. This is the concept, the meta-narrative, an overarching story, philosophy, or worldview that seeks to explain reality. Remember, as we've been studying false teaching, we learned that even points of belief that contradict one another in this new world system aren't seen as a problem. Now, a rational thinker would see a contradiction as a legitimate concern that needs to be examined further. But one of the perverse ironies of this entire subject is that critical theory claims to reject the idea of a meta-narrative or absolutes. Postmodern or critical theory says there is no larger story. Such narratives are oppressive, marginalizing or silencing other people's stories. A meta-narrative is a function of tyranny and totalitarianism. So you can't have one story that explains everything. That leaves people out. But they're lying, because they do have a meta-narrative. They just refuse to call it that. And it begins like this. The world is made up of power struggles. That's an absolute for them, non-negotiable. Critical theory has simply replaced old explanations of the larger story with a new one. Critical theory and social justice sees problems in all kinds of human interactions and organizations. It preaches that those with any power or benefit in society have obtained those privileges through wickedness. And they also define what wickedness is. And that those in power have been forcing their truth on others for centuries, making others comply and accept their own lower positions in society. Because for social justice evangelists, there are two kinds of people, oppressors and victims. The oppressors have controlled everything, including convincing the victims that being a victim is good for them. So the old systems, including, as I said, the nuclear family, church, marriage, businesses, and education, are inherently flawed and contribute to systemic injustice. But there's another truth that they would claim. The truths that come from those who are oppressed, which are different from all the ones we know from history. So what's the solution to this conflicting collection of realities? It's very simple. The solution is to remove power and resources from the oppressors and let the elites determine the distribution equitably. You see, if only the oppressed could take power, that would be, meaning they would be more righteous in handling of that power, and then they could control the language and determine better outcomes for everybody. If this sounds very Marxist, you'd be right again. It is actually a form of Gnosticism. When critical theory is applied, the uninformed, including a lot of us, and less knowledgeable, including myself, must depend on the experts to tell us what we need to know and what we need to do concerning every single aspect of your life. While they may claim that all truth claims are valid, those who have embraced critical theory and social justice in reality have decided that some truths are more equal than others, and they've got them. And you know you've entered the congregation of social justice once you wake up from the old beliefs and come to know the truth. It is a worldview and practice that is determined to burn down existing structures, definitions, and worldviews, and replace them all with a more perfect world of its own design. Those who are unwilling to be enlightened will be left behind or worse. The world needs rescuing. This we agree on. But God's gospel and social justice are diametrically opposed. As believers, we know exactly who that Savior is and how a person can be rescued by repenting of their sin, taking responsibility for their own failures, and surrendering to God by faith alone in His Son. The gospel message is a truth claim, one that declares that truth is objective and personal, found only in the Messiah. Everything claiming to be true outside of Christ is a deception. It is Christ above all. For followers of Christ, we also have a meta-narrative, and I want you to remember this as you go into the week. We began in paradise. We were created in the image of God, with God and man united. But man sinned, so death came, creation fell, and help was needed. Jesus came to rescue us from death. The narrative continues to include Jesus will come back to judge sin, to end death, to renew man and creation, and to restore paradise. And then God and man will be united. The gospel is an overarching narrative, a meta-narrative, that is offensive to social justice and to critical theory. And because of that offense, to continue to speak of the cross will be increasingly viewed as oppressive, offensive, and as an act of tyranny over others. Why? I mean, seriously, why? If critical theory is just an alternative view of the world, a theory, why would it be troubled by any other viewpoint? And this is the second part that I challenge you to wrestle through in the days ahead. The answer is because critical theory and social justice are not just a shared perspective on what life is all about. It is a religion. Postmodernism has applied critical theories to deconstruct what we might agree to call the old religions of human thought, which include conventional faiths like Christianity. And critical theory and social justice have replaced them with a new religion of its own. Ideological social justice is perhaps best understood as a postmodern religious alternative to Christianity. It is a religion that is seeking to undermine and replace the belief system it openly despises. It's not just a way of looking at the world that believers might accept or reject. It is an alternative plan of salvation. See to it. Watch out that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and the basic principles of the world rather than on Christ. Father, please let Jesus be our sufficiency and our all in all. As we go into another work week, in many cases very normal, and the same things that take place from week to week we'll experience again. And in other cases, something new and surprising will come our way. We'll be challenged with some ideas, some thoughts, some friend who brings us a concept, something we hear or see in the news, something that takes place at work or in our school or in our neighborhood or with a very close friend. And we're going to be forced to put that in the mix and decide, where does this fit in with what you've told us is real? So we're desperate once again for your wisdom. And we ask that you'd give us hope to hold on to the meta-narrative that is yours, that Jesus is coming back, that we have something to look forward to even when things are dark, that we have a hope that goes beyond what anything the world can offer, that the philosophy we have is superior to all others because you gave it to us. And I pray that this larger story would carry us through the week, particularly when the discouragement comes knocking at our door, looking to pull us down. We give you this time. We give you our lives. We thank you for this time of year, another proof that you're in charge of nature that you've created. Amen.
Amen. Please stand.